Okay guys, so before we install the new SSD into this Mac Mini, I want to show you sort of a before and after results of the upgrade, and of course what better way to do it than to show you how much quicker this Mac Mini will boot up afterwards with the SSD, as well as showing how much quicker it can load some key applications that I have on the computer. Now, it is worth mentioning that about a year ago I actually already upgraded this Mac Mini's hard drive from the stock 5400 RPM drive to a Seagate Momentus XT 7200 RPM drive with 4 gigabytes of SSD memory. So it's a hybrid drive, and it was probably one of the best upgrades I had made at the time, because it really made booting up and loading apps that much quicker over the stock Apple drive. So anyways, how I'm going to show you this demo is I'm going to go ahead and restart this Mac and start the timer when we see the Apple logo come up, and then stop it when Safari reloads and displays Google's web page. So I've just started the timer, and we'll just wait for it to get into Google. Now, during this time while it's booting, it is worth mentioning that there's not a whole heck of a lot of content on this computer, because it was used as a home theater media PC. So there you go. We have 17 seconds. Basically, if you can't see it, 17 seconds to boot into Mac OS X, and then to show Google. So let's go and do this upgrade and then do the same test. Oh, actually, sorry. Let's actually load some applications here, guys. My bad. We'll basically go to our applications folder. We'll select, for example, let's select App Store. We'll load FaceTime. We'll load Final Cut Pro, GarageBand, load up Handbrake, iPhoto, and maybe my media converter and iTunes. Okay, so there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 applications here. So let's start a timer when I hit enter and see what that's like. And how we're going to do this test, by the way, is that when the icons essentially stop doing the slow bounce and either stop bouncing or go to a fast bounce, and then we'll see how long that takes. So GarageBand here, guys, is still loading. It's taking forever. So about 23 seconds to load all these applications. So let's go ahead and install our SSD and then redo this test again. Okay guys, so I guess the first step in taking apart our Mac Mini to install the data doubler kit is to, of course, disconnect your Macintosh from all the cables and then place it on a non-slip, preferably an anti-static surface, and open up the bottom side of the Mac Mini to gain access into the unit. Basically, for those that have never opened up a Mac Mini, you turn it upside down and you can see that there's a black dot and then a open black dot with the corresponding alignment mark on the bottom cover, and you just basically just twist it open and then pop the lid off like this. And then using a T6 driver bit, we want to remove the 3 screws securing the cooling fan onto the unit. So we're just going to carefully undo these screws. Now, if for those that have bad memory or can't remember where things are placed when you're taking things apart, you might want to mark these off. I've taken this Mac Mini apart a few times now, so it's fairly easy to do. So once you've undone the screw, you want to carefully lift this fan assembly up like this, but don't actually pull it out, but to just take notice that there is a little connector right there that you'll need to use your little spudger tool to get underneath the cable like this, and then just gently pop it out of its socket to disconnect it. Don't ever pull up on the cable because you can actually rip the connector right off of the logic board. And this is what that fan assembly looks like when you removed it. The next step here is to take your T8 driver bit to remove the top Wi-Fi cover here with this screw. And you just undo this. And then undo that. And then we're going to use our hex 2mm hex bit to remove the actual Wi-Fi cover here. And then ever so carefully just lift the Wi-Fi antenna assembly out. And then taking note of the orientation of the cable routing here, we're going to use our spudger tool and carefully just disconnect that Wi-Fi connector off of the logic board. Like this, and then gently remove that antenna assembly like this. Next, using your T6 bit, let's remove the side shroud cover right here by disconnecting, or sorry, unscrewing the one T6 screw right here. And then this just slides out of the way. So basically, inside the Mac Mini at this stage, we have our RAM right here, our hard drive, and then the actual logic board. So the RAM doesn't need to come out, nor does the hard drive at this stage. But what we'll need to do now is also remove the logic board securing screws, which is located here, by using a T6 screwdriver to undo it. And it's a fairly long screw. And then going back to using our hex 2mm bit, remove the logic board securing screw from the chassis. Next, as we proceed to disconnect everything off the logic board, or before we can pull anything, we need to make sure that we disconnect the SATA cable right here by using our spudger tool to lift it up. And then using the logic board removal tool, place the tool into these two holes here firmly, and just don't kind of half push it in. You might want to squeeze the tool together like this and fully insert that tool until it bottoms right out. Now, how we remove the logic board is that once the tool has been fully seated, you don't need a lot of force. You just got to hold the chassis like this and then use your hands to just gently tug on the board and it should come apart. Now, once the board has separated from the chassis, you can remove the logic board removal tool, and then using your spudger, we need to carefully disconnect the IR connector, which is located right here by the memory banks. Again, like the fan connector, you don't want to pull on the connector to disconnect it, but just use your spudger tool and pry underneath the wires. You shouldn't really need to pry very hard because they just kind of pop out in a simple manner like this. And then you can see that that's where it's disconnected for the IR connector and the SATA cable. So we can then proceed to carefully pull the logic board out of the chassis like this. Now, as you're pulling, this will expose the logic board's power cable right here. So again, using the flat end of your spudger tool, we want to just reach in there and disconnect it. Now there's a little ridge on there that helps aid in the prying process, but pretty much that's what it looks like disconnected. So we can now just pull the logic board assembly away from the unibody chassis and set that aside on an anti-static surface for assembly later. To remove the hard drive, we just simply need to use our fingers and just lift and pull straight out like this. It's basically just held in with these two studs that go inside the bracket, and then those two screws we removed for the airport antenna earlier screwed into that, holding this drive in place. So let's pull that out and set that aside. Next, we want to remove the hard drive holding bracket assembly from the unibody chassis by using our T6 bit to remove the screw here and here. Now the first screw, which secures the power supply to the bracket, you need to take note, has a pointed end to it like this, whereas the screw that we're going to remove from this side of the bracket has a flat end. They're both the same length, but it's always good practice to put the screws back where you remove them from. Next, what we want to do is actually remove the power supply assembly out of the chassis. And how we can do this is by removing this metal clip right here, by simply using your tool to grasp the power connector and then sliding it out in this manner, and then turning the power socket 90 degrees counterclockwise like this, and then carefully extract the power supply from the unit. And that's what it looks like. Then the final step here is to just ever so carefully remove the bracket assembly out of the chassis by sliding it straight out the back, taking note that you don't want to damage the IR sensor board, which is located right here. Next, we're going to install the rubber grommets into the hard drive bracket assembly by just carefully using your hands to insert them into your bracket. Now this might take some time because the grommets are quite firm, but in a nutshell, they have to go in properly to hold your drive in place. And that's what a properly installed grommet would look like. It's evenly placed on this side and it comes out evenly on the other side. Continue to do that for the next 3 grommets. Once we've installed the grommets onto the hard drive bracket assembly, we can go ahead and now prep the hard drive for installation. Now, before we do anything or go any further, we need to make sure that we get the orientation of this bracket proper. And so we want to start off with the IR sensor board on the right hand side, and the drive with the contacts will be pointing towards the left in relation to the logic board. And so before we do anything, we want to first install the 2 studs on the lower side of the hard drive bracket side, I guess, which is right here where the IR cable is. And the reason why we want to do this is because it's sort of a pain in the wazoo here to get this screw properly in place of this IR cable that kind of doesn't let your screwdriver get in there very easily. So what I've done is that I've basically screwed in the studs here to just protrude enough, you know, using my eyeball method, enough to just be flush with the grommets on the bracket. And so once we've screwed the studs in on the lower side here, we can proceed to connect the SATA cable, and then ever so carefully just place the hard drive studs into the caddy holder and just examine to see if they're countersunk sufficiently, which in this case they're basically flush. I could probably tweak this one just a bit if I was really particular. Since I'm here, I'll screw that in just a bit more. And then just ever so carefully line up the other 2 screws on the top of the bracket, and then screw them in sufficiently so that they're just countersunk with the surface of the grommet. If you try to screw the screws in on the lower portion of this bracket here, I can almost guarantee you that IR cable is just going to get in your way and cause you nothing but frustration, and you could potentially snap the bracket or strip the threads on the hard drive. So let's not do that. Just a little bit of preemptive care here will make your life a lot easier. So, you know, just double check everything, make sure that the drive doesn't wiggle around here too much. Actually, it shouldn't wiggle at all, and make sure your SATA cable is completely plugged in securely. So once that's done, we can go ahead and grab our macintosh chassis and basically feed this bracket back in ever so carefully and line up the holes that we had removed earlier right here and here. And so you can also take a look to make sure that this doesn't wiggle around side to side, which it doesn't. And we're going to reinsert the power supply next. And one thing to pay attention to is this little metal securing tab here needs to line up with the little notch right here on the inside of the chassis, if you can sort of see that. So we'll go ahead and put that in. Carefully reinsert the Mac Mini's power supply, holding the cable assembly up like this just to clear the bracket properly. So there we go. So the holes line up perfectly and the power supply looks like it's sitting straight and flush inside the chassis. So we're going to go ahead and reinstall our T6 screws. Remember, the pointed screw goes on the power supply side. And screw it in like this. And then just double check to make sure that the power supply and everything is secure. Next, what we're going to do is that we're going to line up our power supply connector back like this and then turn it 90 degrees clockwise to lock it back into place in the channels of this chassis. And it's not really, I don't know how well you can see that, guys, but it's not really locking in place, it's just securing it in the grooves cut out on the top and bottom side of this cover. So then you take this little metal securing clip and slide it up against the bottom side of this connector like this and snap that back into place. We can now go ahead and reinstall the logic board assembly into the chassis. So as you're pushing the logic board in, we need to make sure that we reconnect the power cable to the logic board. And the easiest way I found is to just use your spudger tool to sort of hold the connector in place. And then as you insert the logic board, bring it close enough so that you can actually reattach it. Okay, so you placed everything like this. So once you've connected your power connector in here, we want to just ever so carefully here make sure that our IR cable mates up properly with our logic board as we're inserting it. And then as you press this logic board in almost completely to the lock position, we can then now use our spudger tool to press the IR cable back onto the logic board connector here. And just make sure you use your finger and give that a firm push so it's locked into place. Next, we're going to fully insert the logic board into the chassis. And sometimes, if this power connector doesn't quite line up, you can always use your spudger tool just to kind of give that socket a wiggle so that everything lines up perfectly flush on the Mac. So now that everything is installed, we can just sort of tuck the power cables in behind this SSD like so. And then we can now connect our SSD drive to this extra SATA connector on the logic board. You just want to carefully line this up and then press firmly down on this. Don't press too hard, just firm. And then we're going to take our existing hard drive here, slide that back into the chassis. And what I find sometimes is that to install this lower hard drive is sit the Mac up on the end, and then that allows you to wiggle this drive until you can feel those studs go into the bracket, and then once it's seated you can tell because it sits evenly and you can't move that drive much. We can then reconnect its SATA cable on the logic board by using our finger and just gently pressing down on it. Using a T6 bit, reinstall the logic board securing bolt here. Using our hex 2mm screw, reinstall the outer logic board securing screw here. Double check everything, make sure both SATA connectors are firmly pushed into place, and always double check that IR cable connector to make sure that it too is also seated properly. The worst thing is that you take this computer apart and then find out that you didn't connect something properly afterwards. It's a pain to take it all apart again. Okay, so once we've done that, we can go ahead and reinstall our airport antenna assembly. So I had mentioned earlier that we want to pay attention to the routing of this cable. So we're just going to reinstall it exactly the way we took it out. And feel that snap in, and then carefully use our spudger tool, make sure that those cables go around the screw hole, and then just give that top connector a firm press, and then install the antenna assembly. Now, here's a service tip, guys. I've read in many forums here that the Mac Mini airport antenna can sort of be a pain to get in, as you can see here. So what you do is that there's actually a double ridge along this top side here, and so I find that if I use my spudger tool and just pry up a little bit in various spots, that I can actually flex this grill enough that it locks into that groove properly, and you can see all the holes line up perfectly. So again, these side screws here are hex 2mm, one on each side. And using our T8 bit, reinstall the lower hard drive securing screws. And if you're finding that the hard drive doesn't quite line up, like in the case of what I'm seeing here, just use your spudger tool to just give it a little move to align them to the holes. Don't ever try to force your screws in and strip things. Just give that a firm tightening. So, just to recap, we have a screw here, a screw here, screw here, 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 and here, and then just make sure that you double check your connectors for the first hard drive, your newly installed hard drive, and the IR cable. Next, let's reinstall this little shroud assembly piece. Again, sometimes these parts can kind of be finicky, but in the world of Apple, they always will line up perfectly. To secure the little shroud assembly screw, you're using a T6 and then screwing it down here. Last, we can go ahead and reinstall the fan, but before we do so, carefully align this little cable right here, and then using a spudger tool to just gently press down on it. Now, it's always a good idea to download a monitoring program just to make sure that the fans are spinning. I actually once installed the Mac Mini fan, and I was wondering, it was a good thing I actually opened up my program because it said the fans weren't spinning, and it turned out that my connector wasn't securely placed on the plug properly. So once you've connected it, carefully lower the assembly onto the logic board and then reattach the fan to the board. Okay, so again, double check your work. Make sure your connectors here and here are securely put onto the logic board assembly. Fan screws 1, 2, and 3, and the shroud screw here. If everything is good, no funny screws rattling inside my Mac, that we can then go ahead and reinstall the bottom cover by lining up this white dot to the open dot. Drop that on and then give it a twist to lock it back into place. So this is the screen that I get once I boot it into Mountain Lion, saying that the SSD that I just installed is not readable by OS X. So I'm just going to go initialize, which will open up our disk utility, and you can see here that there is a 256 gigabyte SSD. So I'm going to go here and say partition layouts as current. I'm going to go erase OS X extended journal and just simply go erase. So now this disk is mounted, so we can go ahead and proceed to install OS X via a USB key installer that I had created a while back to install onto the SSD. So I had also mentioned earlier, guys, that on my computer I installed a utility to validate that the fans are running on this Mac Mini. It's all iStat Pro. I don't even know if it's available anymore, but it's here, and you can see that the fans are running at 1799 RPM, which means that the fans are in fact connected properly. So wonderful. We're going to go ahead now and install OS X onto the new SSD drive. Okay guys, so now that we've installed our SSD and a fresh copy of all of our applications and OS, we're going to basically show you the same exact test that we had run before the upgrade. And it's worth mentioning that before, the old OS on the spinning drive was essentially new, so the test conditions are very similar. So we're going to go ahead here and go restart and start our timer when we see the Apple logo here. So we just started our timer, and I would imagine that this should be a little bit faster. If not faster, then so 1585, maybe 16 seconds. I think I hit stop just a hair before Google showed up. So it is a tad faster than the hybrid hard drive that was in there, but where the real test is going to come in comparison. So for reference, the old hard drive took about 17.33 seconds to start up. This one's about 15.85, maybe 16 seconds, sort of an imprecise way of measuring it. But basically, we're going to go ahead and load up the applications that we had selected earlier, which was App Store, Final Cut Pro, FaceTime, the App Store, Final Cut, FaceTime, GarageBand, Handbrake. We said iPhoto, as well as iSkysoft Media Converter, iTunes, and Safari. Okay, so there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 actually. So there's a little bit more here. So who cares? We're going to go ahead and do the same test. We're going to hit open, and when everything stops bouncing is when it will stop. So you can see from the timer here, again, it's not a very precise way of measuring, but 7.73 seconds. And Handbrake's only bouncing because it's asking me to do an update or open up media files. So 23 seconds versus 7.7 seconds or so. So as you can tell, it's more than twice as fast loading apps, and that's where the SSD's beauty comes into play, is that everything just behaves so fast and it's so snappy, and I just absolutely love how quick things are running. So there you have it. It is worth upgrading to an SSD drive onto any computer. It doesn't have to be a Mac, whether it's a laptop, desktop, whatever it may be. It's worth every penny. So there's one more thing that I want to mention for those that are interested in putting an SSD drive into the Macintosh, is that you want to go online and download a program called Trim Enabler. And basically what Trim Enabler is a, well, that's exactly it, is a trim function enabler for OS X. OS X and Apple have a real funny thing of not allowing customers to install SSDs and take advantage of their operating system's garbage cleanup function unless you buy the drives from them, which of course we all know they charge a fortune for subpar performing equipment sometimes. And so basically you can download this from the internet for free. I believe it's from groths.com, so groths.com. And what Trim Enabler does is that it runs a bunch of script code in the back end of OS X to natively turn on the support of garbage cleanup so that you don't, well, one, you get the maximum performance out of your SSD, and two, you get the longest performance life out of an SSD because it basically allows the OS to go ahead and wipe used memory cells and reuse them for data writes. So how you can check once you've installed this, and it says patch is active and trim is active, you can go to the Apple and go about this Mac, go to more info, system report, and then go under your SATA Express tab, field here, and then just double click your Toshiba hard drive where you will see it says trim support yes. So if you don't have Trim Enabler installed and running, it'll actually say trim support no, and so that's not a good thing. So make sure you go ahead and get that free utility so that you maximize the life and performance of your SSD. You know, go ahead and enjoy your new drive. I hope you found this video useful and informative. Rate, comment, and subscribe.